Welcome, Kevin. It's so great to have you here. This is Education 556, and it's called Developing Inclusive Schools, as if that isn't a challenge, huh? Uh,
It's a challenge in the best of times, especially challenging more recently.
yeah, yeah, and I hope we get a little chance to talk a little bit about that. Feels like recent developments keep maybe bringing hope into our space. So that's a good thing. We're here having a conversation with a group of educators, mostly teachers, some administrators, and maybe a handful too of other folks who are interested in education, but may not be actually working in a school right now. But our focus is on schools and classrooms. Of course, though, they're connected to communities and because they're connected to families. So I'm sure we'll bridge out into some of that as well. We are reading your Calvin short. And the one thing I just want to say about that is thank you for writing it. I can hardly imagine the brain power it takes to think about a book as a short on these topics. So, and you mentioned that in the book. So
Yeah.
thank you for that work. I think we'll dive into some of these questions. I've given folks a little bit of background about who you are. And so I think we've known a little bit about that, but I think you as parent, you as father, you as philosopher, you as educator, you as advocate will all come out as we have this conversation. So we'll start just by asking a little bit about, tell us just about your family.
We are an interesting crew. There are 6 people and 3 cats that currently live in our household. You might see one of them, which is wanting to attack me here. So my wife and I have been married 24 years now. We have 3 children. Jameson is the oldest and is now 12. Emmeline is next, and she is 10. And then our youngest, Maggie, is 7. Allison's dad, who just turned 90 last week, has lived with us for about the past 3 years as well. And so I sometimes say that we have 4 kids ranging from 7 to 90. But it's actually a really good opportunity for the kids to get to know their grandfather, for us to be able to help look out for him. And I think in many ways we're just, sort of a not that interesting family. We we're concerned about school, we're concerned about friendships, we're concerned about public health these days, and we're just trying to do the best we can to grow and to live into the opportunities that we have and try to make our communities a bit better along the way.
That sounds like the kinds of things that a lot of families are about. And that's a good thing. Sometimes it takes a little bit more because families find themselves involved in particular challenges and particular hopes and dreams, and they find that the community in which they're living, the society in which and the time in which they are living just doesn't fit really well with some of those challenges, hopes, and dreams. So I'm just thinking, as you were writing, you were talking about the significance of being launched into parenthood. And then on top of that was this whole other piece that came with it. I mean, I think we all as parents, if we become a parent, we realize we suddenly become an advocate in ways we didn't realize. But for you, it seems like it opened up a whole nother space for formalized advocacy work. And so you talk a little bit about that. As we're going into developing inclusive schools, we've been thinking a lot about advocacy. And I am just wondering if you can share with us just a little bit the maybe some of the hardest things about advocacy, particularly in the educational systems. And of course, that reaches right out into the larger sphere. Maybe what have been some of the best parts of that work?
Yeah, let me begin with the best parts because that's sort of the things to celebrate.
Yeah.
One of the first children other than our own that I started doing advocacy work with was back in Idaho. And this was a child that we actually knew the family through mutual therapies in the mutual group therapy program. And when I started working with this family as an actual advocate, their son, who has cerebral palsy, was in, I think, second grade. And because of his cerebral palsy, they weren't even trying to educate him with his typical peers. And the school actually used the fact that he wasn't on grade level as one reason to not have him in the gen ed classroom. But the child has no intellectual, no cognitive disabilities. The reason why he wasn't on grade level was just because he hadn't been given the proper kinds of instruction. And so we worked really hard with that family. And over the course of about 18 months, some of which was done after I moved here to Michigan, he had gone from having his only time together with his age-appropriate gen ed peers being specials like music and art and recess and lunch, to being included 100% of the school time in a gen ed classroom. And it was a huge undertaking. We actually, at one point, we had an 8-hour state-mediated IEP meeting as part of this, spread out over 3 weeks. But to have a family that felt like nothing could be done, and to then have the parents call me later and just said, we have succeeded in getting him 100% of the time, right? And she was just in tears, not this time of frustration, but of joy. I thought, okay, that has made a difference.
That's worth it. Yeah. Oh, that's a great story. It's an important story. It's a strong story, and it reminds us of the power of just coming alongside people, I think, and listening to what they've got going and stepping in with someone, which is important. I'm going to shift in my questions just a little bit, because it makes me, as you talk about it, it makes me think of a question a little bit later where we just talk about school and how we think about the advocacy work that's going on in a school. And I'm wondering, you've now advocated for a number of parents, a number of families, and you've been in a number of schools. Are there certain things that you see or that you've even experienced personally where you say, now this is a place that's beginning to lean into a culture of inclusion? Like, these are the interactions, or these are the things we see and hear that gives us hope. Mm-hmm. And likewise, maybe there's some things where you say, you see this and you hear this and you say, okay, that's going to hit a family in a certain way. So as I think about teachers and administrators listening to this, I'm thinking, it's when you're in the middle of it, when you're immersed in it, you sometimes don't see it. You sometimes don't hear it. You've got a big heart and a good intention, and we can just miss the boat. Mm-hmm. So if you can just think about what are the things you hear and see that make your heart sing in terms of saying, this is a place where someone could belong, and the places maybe where you go, oh, you better check that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you can often do, as you put it, like, I think every educator probably has good intentions. Nobody says, I'm going to have a school that systematically excludes people.
Right.
But the good intentions don't always sort of like flow out into a good system. So I think what you can do is often pay attention to the students, step back and try to visualize or try to understand what's going on through sort of the experiences of the children. I remember once we were dropping off our son to school, and we dropped him off so that we can talk to his aides. And as we walked into the lobby, 2 other students came by and they asked our son, they're like, hey, a bunch of us are going to go play kickball against, another grade before school starts. Do you want to come with us? And our son has no interest in sports. And especially when stuff catches him sort of off guard, his almost always reaction is no. So he said no, and then his friends just waited because they knew him.
Mhm.
And then he's like, yes. So they grabbed him by the hand and they walked off with him to go play kickball. And I just thought, okay, here you have students that know him well enough to wait. They grab his hand and clearly he matters to them, but they would rather him be involved than like win. Okay, if you see that sort of thing, if you see children for whom they're initiating accommodations, or they have internalized them such that it's just part of what they're doing, or that they think, they care more about community than difference or something like that. I mean, then we've got something going right? And similarly, if you walk into a classroom and the other student's response to a child with a disability is to look at them funny, or to why do we have to do that, or something like that, or sort of a begrudging, oh, we have to, right? Then they've probably internalized that from the larger culture, where they think that disability is something that maybe we're sort of legally forced. I mean, the kids aren't going to have that, but that we're sort of like forced to be nice, rather than it being the kind of community. So if you could watch how the children interact in a school, I think that gives you a pretty good picture of sort of what the atmosphere and how well inclusion is happening, how well belonging is being modeled in that school.
Yeah, so in some ways, catching it happened, or seeing a point of light, like, hey, there's a niche or an opportunity. Let's see if we can go into that space and build on that. And yeah, you talk at the end of this book about needing to reorient. And in many ways, as you've gone through the book, you kind of are challenging us to do that throughout. But when you talk about reorienting, and this comes at the end of my questions, but I think it fits really well with this, what I'm hearing you say is it's really important to reorient your perspective, who people are, your perspective of difference, and the so what's around it. And one of the things that you talked about as really important is time. And so when you said this moment where in this example, you said they just gave them space and time and didn't like rush to just accept that and rush to say, okay, fine, whatever, and move on. And I think sometimes schools, not sometimes, almost all the time, schools are so structured by this historical notion of, that's the factory notion and productivity and all of those pieces. But it's very hard to dismantle time. And yet you talk about it's really important as one of the significant frames to shift how you view time. So your example was really good, and I'm just wondering if you have other ideas or thoughts or experiences, either as a family or within your school, where changing your perspective of time kind of made all the difference, and maybe even what you've grown and learned as a family or with friends about time and people as a result of that reorienting.
I mean, I've always been a very task-oriented person, right? I get up, I consume a lot of coffee, and I want to just sort of like knocking through the daily to-do list. And parenthood in general isn't conducive to that. But parenthood with disability is often sort of even less conducive to that. And so it's, for me, it has taught me sort of the importance of slowing down, the importance of thinking about myself not just as a doer of all these things, right? Sort of questioning that idea that we've inherited basically from the Industrial Revolution, that a person's value is in terms of their economic output. I mean, I've had to reorient myself in thinking that about my children, but also about myself, right? My value is more than just how many things on the to-do list for my employer around the house do I need to get done in a given day. I'm also thinking of a time where we got to school and we're dropping off our son, and one of the things we're trying to teach him is sort of independence, personal care skills, and we've been trying to teach him to tie a shoe, and fine motor challenges don't make that particularly easy. And we got there one day and I realized like his shoes were undone and this kind of stuff. I was like, oh, let me fix this real quick, and the director of inclusion actually said, you know what, Kevin, we'll get that. She said, we understand what it's like to be rushed to get 3 kids out the door and to get them to school when it starts. But we've got some time here today. So you know what? I'm not going to let you help him. We're not going to let you do that for him to get it done. We're going to just go back into the inclusion room and we're going to take a few minutes to sort of practice that. And I was like, ouch, you're exactly right. But that kind of hurt to realize, not that she said it, but to recognize how easily I had fallen into this just sort of like, race through the day accomplishing tasks rather than to take the time to slow down and maybe to help our son sort of develop the ability to do things on his own, because you don't develop these skills except over long-term practice. And then that's sort of like shifted over into our parenting in general. When one of our kids wants eggs for lunch, that happened a couple of days ago. I want some scrambled eggs. Okay, well, the efficient way is to let me make them for you. But the better way is, okay, yeah. And now let me watch you make them yourself and try not to be too involved, right? But it's more work, it takes more time, but it teaches them skills. And again, that's something that generalizes, I think, not just to disability, but to students in general and to kids and actually to life. I mean, part of what I've tried to do in my advocacy work is to help model and train parents to how to engage in some of their own advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not easy, but if they can do some of it themselves, then I think that's a good start, and it models hopefully to the children how to start engaging in that themselves.
Yeah, that's good. As you were talking about that and I was thinking about all the different ways you were talking about reorienting, it makes me think about one of the other things where you talk about, well, actually 2 things. One is this notion of dependence and independence. And so it's this interesting space of teaching kids to do things on their own, and yet also within that, recognizing that dependence it's not a polar scale here where dependence is on one end and independence is on the other. And if you're at this point of dependence, that's bad. And if you're here, that's good. I think what you were saying is we all have times in our life when we're independent and times in our life when we are more dependent, and that we have to kind of get rid of this notion that it's on this valued scale. Mm-hmm. In fact, I guess in some ways, when you were giving the example of the teacher, you became dependent on her.
And I don't like it, right? I mean, I've been trained really well to not be dependent. And that's why it hurt, because I had to recognize that the important lesson here wasn't primarily, what our son needed to learn, but what I needed to learn. It's okay to need other folks to help in this kind of way, right? It's okay for our son to need it, but it's okay for me to need it.
Yeah. And so maybe as educators and administrators, it's important if we can embrace the concept of dependence, and not as a negative, but just as it's a thing. It's part of humanity. It's part of who we are. And maybe the best of all worlds is when we have people who have some aspects of independence and dependence, we have interdependence going on in the best ways. But maybe what we need to be thinking about is, well, if we embrace it ourselves, maybe that's a gift we can give to others, whether that's our students or parents. feels like there's a lot of trust that has to go on in order to embrace dependence,
Hmm.
given our cultural, at least here in North America. There's maybe other parts of the world that see it differently. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of vulnerability, right? I'm opening myself up to getting hurt or let down, or this kind of stuff.
yeah,
But as you say, it's profoundly human, right? I mean, we don't expect newborns to be independent. That would be immoral. We shouldn't expect kids to be independent, but we have internalized this idea that adults need to be independent, and right, and I mean, in certain ways we are, but in other ways we're not. And this myth that it's all sort of like rugged individualism, I can do everything by myself, is I think not only false but actually profoundly unchristian. I mean, the Christian picture is of an organic whole that is mutually interdependent. And so I sometimes finding myself saying that, like, I've learned to be a better American than I have a Christian, by internalizing some of these sorts of perspectives that if I stopped and thought about, I'd realize are really antithetical to the things that I say I care most about.
yeah. And that ties with one of the other things that you said. And I'll go to this and maybe one other question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. We could talk for days and years about some of this, or I could anyway. But one of the things that I'm thinking about as we talk about independence, the difference between um, doing to or doing for and doing with, and that reorienting about how do we think differently about what happens when we do with, both as advocates, but I also think just in our interactions with our students, with other teachers who we need. Some people are going to be consultants for them about students. And I'm just wondering if you can speak for a moment about just that concept of the doing with, and ways in which you think schools can really help us understand by how we model that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that doing for is always bad, right? I mean, I try to do things for my spouse to show her that I love her and that I value her. Um, but often when we think of sort of the doing for relationship, we unintentionally sort of set ourselves up, and we're the good person, sort of working down to the disadvantage to help them. And it sets up this sort of like this hierarchy, right, where it can lead us to think that just because we're the person that is sort of aiding with the care or the instruction or something like that, that we're sort of somehow valued better than. Or if we think about it as doing with, right, then it becomes much more cooperative. We recognize that my value is interconnected with that person's value, that we care about the common good, not just the individual good, that we do with to empower, we don't do for simply to feel better about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that the best examples of that are even when teachers or other students in a classroom can recognize that by having students with disabilities in their classroom, it's not just good for the student with the disability, right? That everybody in that community is better off. They're all learning something. There's certain kinds of lessons that are easier to recognize, perhaps, right? I mean, that might not be the only way to get it. But if a teacher recognizes in one class with a student with a disability that mattering, right, sort of that belonging matters more than like the scoreboard at the end of recess or whatever, right? I mean, that's a profound lesson that I want every kid to learn, right? I want every adult to learn. And I think that that's just an example of when we recognize that doing with is about all of us together, and doing for sometimes has this sort of looking down on hierarchy that can be really problematic. Right? We learn an important lesson for all of us in those cases.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we need to be wrapping this up, and oh man, there's just so many questions here that we could still be talking about. I'm wondering if if there's one in particular that you would say, you know what, I'd like to just say a word about this, or, if I have a chance to make a difference in a school community or with teachers and administrators who are listening, this is sort of my bottom line. So I'm just curious if there's something,
Yeah.
either something on the list or the bottom line piece that would be
Yeah.
helpful to us.
A number of things are running through my mind, and I know we need to wrap up. Maybe I'll just go with this one, right? Too often, the way that our educational systems are set up, right, they just sort of focus on compliance. And I don't want to say that compliance is a bad thing, right? And as an advocate, sometimes non-compliance is the thing that I use to get stuff done. But if we recognize that it's actually the human project that matters more than mere compliance, right? That we're here to teach and to learn, and not just to say we followed the state law or followed federal law or got through the Common Core objectives or something like that, right? Sometimes those external checklists are useful if they're put together the right way, but they should never take priority over the human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're meant to be in service of people, not the other way around.
Yep.
Yeah. That's good. That's important. So keeping people front and center, paying attention to them, paying attention to the small interactions and things that are going on, and using those as your leaping off places, to keep in mind the ways in which we can reorient in terms of how we approach and our sort of even our belief, how we approach difference, how we approach vulnerability, and the dance of interdependence that goes with that, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some of the things that you've reminded us of, and they're critically important for us. It's big work to be in schools. It's not easy work, but incredibly rewarding when we see a group of kids who stop and wait and say, pull out that hand and say, come along.
Yeah.
Come along. So so thankful for your work, Kevin. I'm so appreciative of your willingness to take the time to help us think deeply and well. We'll be scouring back and forth throughout the entire semester this short, because the ideas within it are not short. They're deep. I want to just end with a part in one of the chapters where you talk about, and this actually I grabbed from your draft version because my other one was over on campus and I can't get to it, but I think it's close. You remind people, go find them, befriend them, listen to them, and learn from them. Draw close to them, sit with them, sit down with them, or slow down with them. Walk the slow walk with them. Invest in their lives and let them invest in yours. Build the kingdom with them. So when we do this, we all benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that we should all be probably writing on our foreheads and in our hearts, as kingdom builders that we try to be as we follow Christ. So thank you for your testimony on that. And I pray that we will continue to draw on your wisdom, and also that you will continue to be blessed as you are a blessing to us and to others. So thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.